you. That was very, very kind. Thank you, Jean, and thank all of you. That was very sweet. It's been an interesting session and an exhausting one at that. And usually we're pretty tired just from the 2,000 bills that we're looking at and putting a budget together and doing what usually comes in a session. But when you take on an issue and find out there are so many people on the other side, and it was 200 lobbyists on that side, 1 lobbyist on our side, 4 public relation firms on that side, no help on our side. But what we had was the facts on our side. So it was an arduous task to go around and trying to educate everyone, because it's not something you could do in a soundbite. It's not something you could do in a couple minutes. The whole story of the CSX issue would take one-on-one at least an hour and a half to go through it to educate people, and everybody's eyes were glazed over. So I knew that I had to get the votes from the senators, and I knew that I had to start educating the newspapers. And I think that was probably the best thing that we ever did, is I went around and did editorial boards and went to the biggest newspapers first and started inoculating and educating them and providing them with documentation. So when it came time for them to hear the other side, which was very well presented through these PR firms, they had enough knowledge to ask some tough questions. So that was really what kind of propelled us on this. In my 13 years in the legislature, I have never seen such cutthroat, mean-spirited, threatening, arm-twisting pressure on people. We know that lobbyists do their job. That's fine. We know that other legislators apply some political pressure. But when you're threatening people's projects, when you're threatening people's bills, when you're ostracizing people, when you're calling names, but what they were doing was going to every legislator's hometown, finding out who the closest friends they had were, and having those friends from home contact the legislators. Can you imagine how hard it was to hang on to the 26 votes that I had for over a year? And that was my biggest challenge. And when the Mine Trust in Orlando decided the best way to really stick the knife through my heart was to get Lakeland divided and to be able to tell everybody, she's not representing Lakeland. Look, Lakeland's fine. Lakeland wants it. And when people in Lakeland were standing up in committee, when the lobbyists from Lakeland was standing up in committee and saying, oh no, we're okay with it, that should have been the death knell. But people saw through it, and everybody stuck. And then the last and final tactic that they had was, let's pull away the South Florida individuals. And to pull away South Florida, they have, and for those of you who don't know the issue that well, I'm not going to go into the whole issue unless you have questions, but what is existing now is in South Florida there is a commuter rail system, the only commuter rail system we have in the state of Florida, called Tri-Rail. Covers 3 counties, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach. It started 20 years ago, and 20 years ago it had almost no ridership. It took 20 years to build up to 15,000 riders a day, and that's considered decent ridership. At 15,000 riders a day, the Tri-Rail system loses $80 million a year. And the state subsidizes about $20 million, but they still need additional money. And Tri-Rail has said, we don't want the state subsidizing us, and we know mass transit isn't going to pay for itself, but we want a dedicated funding source so we can do it locally. Because if we don't get money, we're going to have to cut back service. And if we cut back service, we're going to go from that 15,000 riders, which it took us 20 years to build up to back into the single digits. So give us a dedicated funding source. And the people who wanted Sunrail so badly said, we're not giving you a dedicated funding source unless you vote for our Sunrail. And here's the most ridiculous part of that. Sunrail learned nothing from Tri-Rail's experience. This Sunrail program, which was, we were paying CSX way too much, still didn't have a dedicated funding source built in for Sunrail. So they were going to be in the same situation that Tri-Rail is in, but it's even worse. In Sunrail, the Orlando system, it didn't go to the airport, it didn't go to Disney, it didn't go to iDrive, it didn't go to University of Central Florida, it didn't go anywhere people wanted to go. And by their own ridership projections, it was only going to have 3,500 riders. 3,500 riders, doesn't go where they wanted to go. We were paying CSX $432 million for 61 and a half miles of track. Then we were going to allow them to continue running freight on that track. Then we were going to pay $198 million for them to improve a different line of track so that they could move all the freight out of Orlando and into Lakeland. And then they wanted an ILC, which is a rail yard, and they wanted it in Winter Haven because Winter Haven sold them land cheap, which in and of itself would not have been a problem, except for you're now moving the freight from this line that would have gone to Winter Haven to this line, which now had to come through Lakeland to get to Winter Haven. And CSX wasn't paying for it. The taxpayers of the state of Florida were paying $23 million for the ILC in Winter Haven. We're paying $9 million for an access road. We're paying $198 million for the S-line improvements, and then all the money to purchase the track over in the Orlando area. If that wasn't enough, then they wanted to transfer all of the liability off of CSX onto the backs of the taxpayers. And you know what? They used as their argument, but for commuter rail, we wouldn't be subject to that liability. Okay, so if you follow that line of thinking, you would say if there's a commuter rail train and a freight train sharing the same track, which it would have for about 5 or 7 hours a day, then in those instances, we ought to say, even if it's CSX's fault, we're going to cover the damages. So I said, if that's truly your argument, the but for commuter rail, CSX wouldn't be in the position to be liable, then why are you making us pay for trespassers? Why are you making us pay when a commuter train isn't even involved? So I tried to amend all of that out in committees that were stacked against me, in committees who had chairman of each of those committees as an Orlando member who was pushing the bill. We knew the battle was going to the floor because the way the committee structure was set up, I didn't have a chance in the first 2 committees. I had a chance in the 3rd committee and ended up losing 3-4 because they bought off a South Florida legislator with the tri-rail issue. And in the 4th committee, where I had the votes to kill it, they took it out of the committee. So now the battle was going to the floor. When they took it out of that committee, we still had over a week to go. So every day on the floor of the House, I could not leave my seat to go to the restroom. I could not leave my seat for anything because I knew it would come up when I was gone. So people were constantly covering for me. And it was very stressful. I had radio shows calling me saying, can she step off to do something? And I'm like, I'm not leaving. Under no circumstances am I leaving my seat. So the only thing I did was work the room, and every member of that Senate was so tired of hearing me say, and I've got to tell you, imagine being in this room from 10 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night, and you're in session, and you got chairs, and everybody's in the room, and it's bill after bill after bill, and I'm saying, are you still with me? Are you still with me? Are you still with me? Are you still? They were getting so tired of hearing. They were like, yes, yes, yes. But the other side was convinced they had the votes. And I thought, how could you possibly have the votes? I trust every single one who said that they're with me. So on Thursday, I pulled a procedural move that the vote that came out on that procedural move showed the other side they didn't have the votes. And they were dumbstruck. They were so shocked. So overnight, they really kicked into high gear. They brought up county commissioners from South Florida just to beat on these people. And most of the legislators from South Florida, the senators, were all Democrats. So, I know that we're very partisan here tonight, being the Republican Executive Committee, but I have to tell you, the Democrats were so awesome in joining with me on fighting this, especially the ones who said we could be heroes by saving Tri-Rail, but all we need is $30 million a year, and if we pass this ridiculous piece of legislation, we're spending $2.6 billion of taxpayers' money and transferring the liability. And they knew they were going to get beat up at home. They were getting a lot of pressure, and a lot of them stuck with me. In the end, the vote was 24 to 16. One Democrat was absent, so it showed up as 23 to 16, but he did sign how he would vote, and one of the Republicans agreed to pair, or one of the yes votes agreed to pair their vote so that he would be recorded as voting, and then at the last minute they decided not to. So the actual vote was 24 to 16.